Okay. I want to welcome everybody to the meeting of the North Jersey Civil War Roundtable. Um, Included in this audience today are people from various libraries. As a public service, we've offered our program to libraries, and it's being carried, and it's carried through Roxbury, Rockaway. Um, Parsippany was the original host of our programs, and we offer this program to any library that wants to carry us. It's our public service; doesn't cost anything, obviously. And just like you watch PBS, where the name's scrolling at the end, that's us, and that's what we want right now. For the Normally, I give a commercial as to what we are and who we are, but we're in North Jersey. But what happened with Zoom, or with COVID rather, um, we just stopped having meetings and people weren't interested in going to meetings. So we now became purely on Zoom. And very frankly, tonight it's 9 degrees or 11 degrees outside, and I would not want to go to a meeting, and I'm the president. So we're happy with Zoom. And as a result of it, we picked up members from out the United States, from 11 states, including California, including from in New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, uh, much of the states on the eastern coast, and including Barry Crompton, who I don't know if he's on yet, but he's a member from Australia, and from Venezuela. Is from Batista, I'm sorry, is from Venezuela, who's on tonight. So we're attracting this type of audience, and we're glad, and it gives us the opportunity to meet a lot of people. Uh, Okay, for the past 20, now we start really, for the past 20 years or so, our roundtable has had a program, at least one or two programs on Abraham Lincoln. And in addition, covering in a tangential way, is we are the only Civil War roundtable to host a legal program, strictly the legal issues. And Tom is had been one of the presenters, and Jay Maloney, whose picture now is blacked off, has been one of the presenters. This program that we're doing on Civil War legal is a very prestigious program. 2 years ago, our program was being offered as a continuing legal education course in New Jersey for attorneys. So we've taken it beyond, and we've taken this our programs beyond of the expertise. And I should point out that as part of our roundtable, we have already had two Pulitzer Prize winners, James McPherson and Eric Foner, and then we had you name the leader, you name the person. We have James Webb Robertson, Craig Simons, uh, outstanding Michael Burlingame, uh, Ed Bars. These are some of the people who have spoken before our group over the years. Now, okay, this program tonight is unusual. It's going to be a dialogue, basically, with Tom Hildner and I discussing this program. I will come in and give basically a narrative, and Tom, where it comes to the legal aspect, he's going to come in. So we'll be going back and forth with each other on a dialogue. Bearing in mind on a program, a lot of people are here for the first time. They're not really conversant with what we are, and I have to bring a introduction to what this is going to be. The program is the evolution of the president, and eventually we'll get to the president. For the first 5 or 10 minutes, I just wanted to bring you up to other people to tell what has happened on this situation. Abraham Lincoln was nominated for president of the United States. During this period of time, he did not campaign. They didn't campaign at that time. And anytime anybody would ask what he intended to do, he says, I have already said what I've had to say. So, in other words, he's not really telling what he's going to do. He is elected president of the United States with less than 40% of the vote. And at this point, the two Democratic parties, John Breckinridge and Douglas, and then there's a Constitutional Party. Lincoln isn't even on the ballot. Lincoln even isn't on the ballot. in the southern states, but he does have the electoral votes to do. Bearing in mind on the Civil War, over 10,000 books, biographies have been written about Abraham Lincoln, probably more. Over 10,000 books have been written about the Civil War. And yet, these biographies are different. I personally have over 2 shelves of books just on Lincoln biographies, to the consternation of my wife, who says, "What are we going to do with these?" And yet, I've met other people who also biography, and they say, "That's all you have is only 2 shelves." Okay, each of these books add a different perspective, and this is our program tonight. It's going to add a different perspective. I have never seen a program devoted just to Lincoln's inauguration speech and Lincoln's speech on July 4th. And we're going to be explaining to this point. Okay. Lincoln, at this point, is elected president in November. He doesn't say anything. People come to him, and basically his only speech is, welcome, etc. I've said what I've had to say, and that's the extent of the campaigning. They did not campaign, although Stephen Douglas did go down south and was campaigning. However, Lincoln basically stayed on his house, and people came to him. When it was time to go in March, now at this point, before the 20th Amendment was passed, the date was in March when the president would be inaugurated. It was under the Roosevelt administration that the 20th Amendment is passed, and it brings it down to the present day. Also, what we're going to come in contact with is also the elected representatives. Although they're elected in November, they do not take office until the December of the following year. That's 11 months. The Constitution provided that the meeting would take place in December. They met once a year. That's provided for. And again, that's changed by the 20th administration. So in the meantime, what happens is Lincoln is elected. The Congress, even though they're elected, it's the previous group that's now sits in session, and they only sit for a short period of time. Okay, now Lincoln at this point, before in May, starts his trip across the country to go to Washington, and he makes well over 100 stops, speaking before various groups, and he's going to make his way through. He's going to make his way to Washington. What does happen, and this is where we're going to be coming through, and Jay is going to explain when we go through. As he's coming through, he's going to go through Baltimore. What happens is they receive word that he's going to be attacked. Alan Pinkerton is one of them. General Scott is another one of them. And you remember the nurse, Dorothea Dix, actually gives him warning that he's going to have a problem in Baltimore. The train didn't go, the train went through Baltimore, but it stopped. They weren't allowed to have steam engines, so the cars were taken along by horses until the next train, which is on the other side of the town, or 6 or 8 blocks away. But when they realized this, Lincoln, at this point, bypasses it. He goes to Harrisburg, and then he takes a different train at night and basically sneaks in. Nobody knows he's in. They have him in a car. They said there's somebody sick in the car. They don't pay attention to it. And it comes in at a totally different time, much earlier than the others. And he makes it into Washington. He basically sneaks into Washington. Okay, so now Lincoln is in, and he is going to give his inauguration. He is going to give his inauguration speech, in which he does in March. The inauguration speech at this point, when he comes in, to give it. 6 states have already seceded. Now, this is what we're going to be discussing a little bit later. What's the difference between a rebellion and a secession? And that's what Tom is going to be discussing here. So, in the inauguration speech, which is in March, 6 states have already left the Union. That's South Carolina, that's Georgia, that's Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Texas is going to join a little bit later, but he has already 6 states who said we're no longer part of the United States. And what Lincoln is doing in this first, what Lincoln is doing is he's going to say why we should stay together and what happens. Now, this is going to be hard. It's 1861. I want you to imagine that it's 1861. You can't think about what's going to happen. You can't key yourself forward. You have to stay within 1861 to fully appreciate this lecture. You're going to say, well, this is what happened later. This is what's going to happen. Or even worse. And this is what happened. I literally had to edit my own speech because there was a recent inauguration going on. And I kept going back and forth, or I kept going back into later periods of time. And the answer is you have to accept this is 1861. We don't know what's going to happen. And that becomes the first speech. Oh, by the way, if you do have questions, we ask you to put them in the chat box, and Abigail will look at them later and read them out to us. Okay, so this becomes the evolution of the president. Now, I'm just trying to. It's now July. It's now March 3rd, 1861, and he's going to give the inauguration speech. He begins to mention the fact, and here's where Tom's going to come in, that we are part of a perpetual union. And what does that mean? Tom, you're on.
Okay. All right. Well, I think it's helpful to look at it, what is the basis that Lincoln offers for claiming that it's perpetual? Of course, obviously the consequences, if it's perpetual, then it cannot be dissolved. The South cannot secede. So the argument is that secession is impossibility, therefore secession is void. So how does he get to the point where he says it's perpetual? And he based it on what he would call a contemplation of universal law and the Constitution, that this is part of the universal law of government and constitutions of perpetuity. And he says it's implied. It's not said anywhere in the Constitution that says this is perpetual. As we'll talk about in a little while ago, mentioned the Articles of Confederation. They refer to a perpetual union, but this does not. So he says it's implied. It's not expressed, but it's implied in the fundamental law of all national governments. He says no government ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination. No suicide provision in its Constitution. Nothing in our Constitution, he says, provides for its dissolution. Now, the South argued that the Union was based on a contract, but making a contract, Lincoln says, requires all parties to do so, and this is unilateral by the South. Then he turns to history, and he says that the history of the Union itself confirms it is perpetual. And the Union, he says, is older than the Constitution. Indeed, it was formed by the Articles of Association in 1774, which was related to the first Congress. It was matured by the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It was further matured, and the way he puts it, almost by way of an engagement or plight, it's kind of a marital analogy, by the 13 states expressly plighted is the words he used, and engaged that it should be perpetual. In other words, agreeing that it should be perpetual, and that in the Articles of Confederation. And then, so we have this going into the Constitution. Now, one of the declared objects of the Constitution in 1787 was to form a more perfect union. And Lincoln says, and his address is a combination of history, it's a combination of law, it's a combination of policy, it's a combination of logic. So what he concludes here is that for the union to be a more perfect union, the destruction of the union by one or part of it makes it less perfect than before the Constitution. And why? Because it has lost what he calls the vital element of perpetuity. Now, what does he conclude? What follows from all of this is that resolutions and ordinances of the states to withdraw from the Union are void, and therefore acts of violence within a state, as had happened with regard to several federal facilities and so forth, are against the authority of the United States, are therefore insurrectionary or revolutionary. In short, in Lincoln's view, the Union was perpetual. The attempt to secede or terminate the Union was void, and therefore the Union was unbroken.
What I also wanted to point out too in the beginning, and Tom, I'm going to ask you again through this. Lincoln point blank, when he starts his inaugural address, he is trying to tell them that I don't want to change anything in here. And a matter of fact, one of the things which I will ask you to go into detail in just a few minutes, is the Fugitive Slave Act. This is something you don't expect Lincoln to do. What we learn is Lincoln's freed the slaves, et cetera, and he's a great guy. But if you go back in time and you look at his previous talks, especially when Lincoln Douglas, pretty obnoxious speeches through here. And one of the things he says is the very first page, the first paragraph, he says, I'm not going to change anything. I'm not going to change slavery, and I will support the Fugitive Slave Act. This is the act, probably one of the worst pieces of legislation enacted through this thing. And Tom, I'm going to ask you to explain. Now, the reason I'm saying is, if you're part of this audience that's watching it, you're going to hear the word habeas corpus. You're part of this crowd that's standing in front of the president. You're not going to really understand what habeas corpus is. These new, excuse me, the Fugitive Slave Act. Maybe you heard of it, but I'm jumped ahead of it. I'm sorry, Frank. Explain what the Fugitive Slave Act is and what it was so terrible about it.
Okay. Well, what Lincoln is addressing, as you pointed out a moment ago, Rich, is he's addressing what he perceives to be an apprehension that exists among the people of the southern states. And he says there's never been any reasonable cause for such an apprehension. And he points to what he calls the most ample evidence to the contrary, which has been open to inspection. He refers to his record and things that he has said. He quotes from an earlier speech in which he said he had, quote, no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it existed, and no right nor inclination to do so. He then turns to what he terms the most conclusive evidence of what the case is susceptible of showing, that the property, the peace, and the security of no section of the country, obviously then the South, are endangered by his administration. Now, the protection which can be given is consistent with the Constitution and the laws, and that protection consistent with those will be cheerfully given to all states when demanded. Now, at this point, the Fugitive Slave Act is passed in 1850 as part of the Missouri Compromise. Then he notes that he doesn't give the dates, but between 1850 and 1860, there's been a lot of controversy about delivering up fugitive slaves. By the way, He doesn't call them fugitive slaves. He calls them fugitives from service or labor. Lincoln pledges to adhere to the fugitive slave provision of the Constitution, which is found in Article 4, Section 2. And that kind of interestingly follows the extradition clause in the Constitution. I guess returning the fugitive slave was another form of extradition. And the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution was part of the Great Compromise that facilitated the adoption of the Constitution, and without which the Union could not have been formed. And what it provides is that no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom service or labor may be due. Now, interestingly, as I said, the word slave does not appear in this clause, and the word slave does not appear in any provision of the Constitution. Now, as part of this constitutional provision, what Lincoln pledges to do is to enforce the laws made to enforce and implement that constitutional provision. And foremost of these was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Although he doesn't specifically name the Fugitive Slave Act, he doesn't say call it out by name, but by implied through the discussion. Now, that act was a response to Southern elements, the Southern attempts of desires to federalize apprehension of runaway slaves while denying states any power to interfere. And it was signed by President Fillmore. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act was a source of raging controversy between 1850 and 1860 when Lincoln was elected. And given that, the fact that Lincoln is pledging to enforce the fugitive slave provisions of the Constitution as implemented by the Fugitive Slave Act is stunning to many people, because it was considered such a horrible act with so many horrible effects, anywhere from legal to personal, and all sorts of vivid stories of how, when implemented, there was suffering and grief. Now, just briefly, Jay Maloney and I did a program on the Fugitive Slave Act a few years ago, and we'll be detailed. But to help refresh your recollection, if you're not familiar with it, is the act authorized commissioners, who were low-level judicial officers appointed by the U.S. Circuit Court judges, to preside over all aspects of fugitive slave proceedings. They could exercise concurrent jurisdiction with federal judges. They could issue warrants against and appoint deputies, hold hearings, and issue the dreaded certification of removal, which permitted the slave to be removed from the state and returned to his master or her master. The alleged runaway slave under this act was denied due process. He was denied the right to a jury trial, and I'll say he just rather than say he and she constantly. He was denied the right to a jury trial. He was denied a right to appeal or to seek relief from another court. There was no habeas corpus, which is ironic that we'll be talking about that a little bit later with respect to Lincoln. Indeed, his situation was so desperate he could not even testify. Now, the claimant could sue the fugitive or alternatively obtain a warrant and assistance from a commissioner under this act. As a proof of the status of this person who might claim, I'm not a runaway slave, I never was a slave, you have the wrong person, or whatever, a certificate of a Southern court issued ex parte, without hearing from the slave or the fugitive, ex parte to the slave owner, was to be taken by the commissioner as full and conclusive evidence of the fact of escape. You can see how draconian this act is, why it was so upsetting. And here's Lincoln saying, I'm going to enforce it. The only open issue really under this act was the identity of the captured prisoner. And even this was subject to a summary determination by a commissioner who was authorized to rely on a general description of the slave, the person being sought, provided by, guess who? The slave owner. Now, just a couple of quick things that are interesting, to show how difficult it was. Even the commissioners had a little bonus for issuing certificates of removal because they got $10 for granting a certificate and only $5 if they ruled in favor of the alleged slave. Indeed, it was a crime to obstruct or hinder the seizure of a fugitive, or to assist in his rescue, or to harbor or conceal him. So that was something new, where now the population is being involved in this. The use of state courts, which had been used in various instances, and there's a lot of interesting law in that, to protect fugitives, was prohibited. Federal marshals or other suitable persons appointed by commissioners were given the power to call to their aid bystanders. You could, in effect, be drafted to help, capture the fugitive slave. And if, in fact, you didn't do it and the slave escaped, you could be liable in damages to the amount of the value of the slave. So that is the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, Lincoln does allude to some of the controversy regarding the law. For example, whether the constitutional provision should be enforced by a national or state authority. But in the end, as he points, it really makes no difference to the slave. That's immaterial, as long as it's enforced. He also suggests that any law on the subject should include safeguards of liberty to which citizens are entitled. In other words, it could be that should be changed, but he's willing, whatever its faults, to enforce it as is. That's basically a great shock, well, it was consistent with his prior statements, but it certainly had a powerful impact on the population in the North.
One thing I just wanted to add is once the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, slave traders made their way up north, and they just acted. So this is horrendous as far as the North is concerned, and yet Lincoln is coming across and says, "Yeah," and that's also part of it. And that's what I think becomes the terrible thing. The other thing is Lincoln automatically, when he's trying to assure the South, he says, "Look, we're not going to take your property. That's not what we're here for. Everything is going to stay the same. It will be the same," which is important because you realize you're part of a conquered nation. The South is at this point, they're going out is because whether you want it or not, Lincoln says that slavery is the issue of the Civil War. I know there are people out there going, no, it's states' rights. It's not. What are the state rights? The right to try to tariff? You're going to send your kid to because of a tariff? You're going to have go into war for this? No. And it's constant through the South. And when they do their constitution, they do provide for slavery through there. And if that's going to come in 2 days later, is the Constitution of the Confederate States through that. Before we go on, so in any event, Lincoln is trying to show we don't want to do anything to you. Everything's going to be the same. He mentions in it that the South has already taken over arsenals, taken over bases, taken supplies, and they are now taking over everything. This is as the result of this during the 7 months that occurred. And Lincoln said, and Lincoln even goes as far to say, look, we're not going to force our people who work in the federal departments on you. If you don't want them, we'll take them out. That's going to create the issue. And as a matter of fact, in order to be on your good side, we will continue to pay the postal service through this, even though you've decided against this. But I have to read the last time. Lincoln is such a great writer, and it's probably out of sequence, but I just love this line where he's talking, and this is probably one of the folks you probably had to memorize this in school in any event. And he goes, in your hand, my satisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is a momentous issue of civil war. will avail you. We have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. And here's the paragraph this everybody knows. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have though passions may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. Here, watch the next line. You know this one. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriotic grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nation. That's the end of it. I just one thing I don't want to do is paraphrase Lincoln. He is such a great writer. You see it later on. Abigail, got to, whoever Moon is taking it. Bring your picture back in again. Okay, now the
You know,
next part of it.
Rich, before you do that, I just wanted to add one thing we cover, but you know, what's also stunning in connection with, not so much in connection with Lincoln's willingness to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, but he's also willing to accept what's called the Corwin Amendment, which would have been the original 13th Amendment. And that provides that no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with slavery, although they call it persons held to labor or service. So Lincoln was so far is he was willing to accept that. Indeed, it was approved by the House of Representatives and by the Senate in February and March, respectively, but it was not ratified by the states. And the 13th Amendment, as finally passed, was certainly a whole lot different from that.
Yeah, that was also the amendment. The amendment says this amendment can't be amended.
Right.
Yeah, and that's the important part, and that's what he's agreeing to, and this is what he's trying to do to keep the country together again. Okay, now we're going to go to Lincoln. I told you before, Congress is not in session. So what Lincoln does is he calls a special session on July 4th, very symbolic name. And by the way, one thing I noted on both of these, Lincoln starts both addresses fellow citizens, whereas Davis says federal states. That's what the important part. But Lincoln brings in this touch of fellow citizens. Lori, another name popped up. Abigail, another name popped up. The before I go on to what that's the special session is, I have to bring you up to what happened in between. You would have known this. Remember, it's 1861. Although it's not in Lincoln's special address to Congress, this is what people would have known. Fort Sumter, war has been declared, and Fort Sumter was attacked. I'm going to go into detail about this. But what does happen is, and then this will come into the habeas corpus aspect of it. In Baltimore, on April 19th, an issue has occurred. The 5th Massachusetts leaves Massachusetts, and they are coming, and they are
Rich, your lights are off.
Yeah, I know the light went off. What can I tell you? The bulb burnt out. It's my luck.
I guess it's a dark period of history you're talking about.
Yeah, that's good. Wait, let me turn the other light on. Let me see what happens here.
This is reminiscent of poor Jay Maloney when he was giving a legal presentation years ago and the power was lost all over that section of New Jersey.
Yeah, that was our situation. So Jay had to get a
He
flashlight.
got the Hero of the Year award for that.
And now I had a bulb burn down. Okay, so it's going to be a little glary or whatever, wherever I'm coming from. So, okay, this is what I wanted. This is before he gives speech. Now, people would have known this. And by the way, when I talk about the special session, this was really, it wasn't really a speech. It was read by the clerk of the court and a droning mansion, but people would have read this. They were literate. speeches would have been this would have been published in the paper and was subject to discussion. So they knew what it was, although they didn't physically hear it and they weren't present. But this they knew, and it's not contained in here, but it does explain what habeas corpus is. Basically, I'm going to go into detail. You're arresting somebody. You're just arresting somebody and putting them in jail, period. When I originally read about it, I never really agreed with what happened. But doing further research into this, this is what happens in April. In April 19th, 5 days after Sumter has fallen, the 5th Massachusetts Regiment goes to Washington. When they come to Baltimore, the train doesn't go through Baltimore. What happened? There was an ordinance that steam engines can't go through. So the train would stop at one end, and then it was physically taken by horses across town to attach to the railroad that was going to Washington. What has happened on the trains or the tracks is they've blocked the tracks. And what happens is the colonel on the train says to the soldiers, "You're going to come out and we're going to march to the other train. You are not to, they're going to throw stones at you, they're going to throw bricks at you, but we will continue to march. The only thing you're going to be able to defend yourself is if they shoot." And so the soldiers get out and they're marching with a band and everything. And they're going to march across the town. What happens is a fight breaks out. They are throwing the stones, they are throwing the rocks, and a pistol, and somebody fires a shot. And with that, it's called the Pratt Street riots or the Baltimore riot. 5 soldiers are killed. 12 civilians are killed. Oh, by the way, here's a trivia question, which you've never seen, but for people, trivia question, who's the first soldier to die? And it's Luther Ladd. So that's the first soldier of the Civil War to die in this. That's a trivia question. And there won't be a test at the end, so you won't be asked that. I shouldn't kid around like that. People believe there's a test. There were students watching through this. A day later, bridges are destroyed. And what happens to that is at this point, Lincoln habeas corpus comes into effect, and supposedly the bridge was the Maryland regiment was destroying this. So what the habeas corpus does at this point, and this is before he's taken the stand, and Tom will develop the point. What they do is they arrest the council, the Baltimore council, the police chief, and they're put in jail without any prison. And inclusive the following day is John Merriman is also arrested and put into jail. And this becomes a story of itself. And people would have known this before when Lincoln goes into detail about habeas corpus. Tom, so I'm going to ask you to do habeas corpus right now, because rather than start the speech.
All right. Well, habeas corpus is a writ that is, goes back to the English common law of hundreds of years ago. It is basically a right of somebody who is detained, arrested, or imprisoned for a determination whether there is legal justification for their being so held and determined, and whether they should be released. Habeas corpus means have the body. So what is involved with a writ of habeas corpus is a petition is made to a court to issue such a writ to bring this person before the court so a determination can be made as to whether that arrest or imprisonment is justified under law. The Constitution doesn't provide for a writ of habeas corpus in any specific way. We talk about due process of law, which this is considered part about. But what it does provide in Article 1, Section 9, is that it cannot be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So it can be suspended when you have a situation of rebellion or invasion, and when the public safety may require it. Now, Lincoln authorized the military authorities, as you said, to suspend the writ in the interest of public safety. And as you also mentioned, Congress was out of session, so he suspended it on his own authority. The question then arose, does he have the authority to suspend the writ of habeas corpus? And you mentioned Mr. Merriman, and there is a case, ex parte Merriman, which was decided. And if you were able to judge shop this one, you wouldn't have picked the judge that was chosen. It was Chief Justice Roger Taney, the author of the Dred Scott decision, who was sitting as a circuit court judge. And he held that Lincoln had no authority to suspend the writ or authorize its suspension under the Constitution. According to Taney, that power was reserved to Congress. Lincoln ignored Taney, and Taney, interestingly enough, thought he might be arrested for giving this opinion. Now, Lincoln responded to the questioning about his legal authority to suspend habeas corpus, the propriety of doing that, in the July 4th, 1861 speech. He contends that it was legal. He said, we had a case of rebellion, and that I keep saying public service because they're in my house looking at my furnace today. So public service has now become, public safety has become public service. That public service required its suspension. But he points out, or he claims, it was used sparingly. He also argues that the Constitution is silent as to who is to exercise the power, the executive or Congress. He asserts it is the executive. Congress was not in session in any event, and he concludes that it was not the intent that the danger should run its course until Congress convened, which might actually have been prevented under certain circumstances by the rebellion. Lincoln also argues that even if it were illegal, it was necessary for the survival of the Union in an emergency situation, and that's exactly what we had going on at that time in 1861 and thereafter. He says kind of in an offhand way, or indicates an offhand way, that the Attorney General is going to be looking into this, and this may be the subject of legislation that might be presented later on. And indeed, if my memory is correct, in 1863, there was a habeas corpus act that authorized what Lincoln had done.
What I was looking at there, what I was looking at, several things. One thing we bring in as far as the inauguration is Lincoln has several grounds. One, he's going to create the army. One, he wants permission to raise $400 million and 100,000 troops, and he can't do that. That's one of the reasons. And the other is he's looking for the Constitution, rather the legislature, to approve the acts that he has committed. And that is, of course, the habeas corpus. But the other thing that Lincoln goes into detail is a rebellion or secession. And Tom, you're going to go into detail, but I got to tell you something. One of the things where Lincoln is blamed, or to a certain extent, for having this war start. Now, we're running a little late. Normally, I would go into the position I would go into what happened with Fort Sumter, and I'll go on just briefly into this. You know the story with Fort Sumter. They're basically out of food. They're starving, and Lincoln says, I want to bring a ship in for provisions only. This is a lengthy story. It's a whole book of what through a comedy of errors, and they refuse to allow the ship to come in. A few days before the surrender of it, they go out and they say to Anderson on Fort Sumter, we want you to surrender. He says, look, I'm running out of food. I'll have to surrender on my own. Lincoln, at this point, what happens is South Carolina fires on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter, of course, you know, is an island in Charleston. It's created to stop out a seaboard invasion. Has nothing to do with they being fired on, and they can't fire back because the guns are pointed in the other direction, and that's basically it. So this is what Lincoln has said in the first one: we are not the aggressors. We don't want to be the aggressors. So South Carolina basically starts. What they do is they start the war. This is what they've done. I've given out a little short shrift of what happens here. They're also now, the next point they're concerned about is if this is a rebellion or is a secession. And Lincoln goes on quite extensively into the difference between a rebellion of secession. By the way, I got to point out one thing. When I was stationed in Gunter Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, I guess as you further go, it was called the War of Northern Aggression. And the United States, and up here they call it the War of Rebellion. The official records are War of Rebellion, but down south they call it the War of Northern Aggression. That's where we're coming from at this point. So the difference is where we're going to go. He's going to go into detail. If is this a rebellion, an act against the government, or do they have or this is secession, which gives them the right to leave the Union? And at this point, and if they do leave that, then of course they're another country. If it's a secession. So, Tom, I'd like you to go into detail about this. And I told you we're going to take a long time. And we discussed with difference between rebellion and secession.
Okay, just very briefly, the discussion that you're referring to builds on parts of the first inaugural address, and just in a very brief summary, in that address, Lincoln argued that no government. He argued that secession is an impossibility. No government provides for its own destruction. He said if the Union is a compact, as the South wanted to look at it, then all parties must consent to its termination. We mentioned that briefly. He said the foundation of the nation predates the Constitution. We went into that. He said secession is the essence of anarchy. Any state voting for secession, that action is null and void. So that's all in the inaugural. And also that he has no power to negotiate this because they can't secede even if they wanted to, and he can't negotiate with that. So secession is also physically impossible in his view because the states that are contiguous to each other. So now we get to the July 4th one, and the South, as you mentioned, calls its departure from the Union secession. And Lincoln says, well, you know, to call it a rebellion, if they did that, would imply violations of law. In fact, they are traitors. And he knew their people, he knew that the people of the South, and he makes reference to this, he says, the people of the South have moral sense, devotion to law, devotion to order, pride, and reverence for our government and institutions and history. Same as other civic and patriotic people. Now, why does he say that? He says that in relation to this issue because it's not the people of the South who are doing this. It is the leadership of the South. He is not blaming the Southern populations for this. So he, in fact, refers to the leaders as see this as in commencing an insidious debauching of the public mind, you know, using that term of wanton conduct. And the public mind is idea of a public consciousness. That's something he developed in earlier speeches during the debates. He says they've invented an ingenious sophism, which, if you follow that, it would lead logically to the destruction of the Union. You know, but what is the sophism? I guess the sophism. is that any state of the Union may, consistent with the Constitution, lawfully and peacefully withdraw from the Union without consent of the Union or any other state. That's the sophism he's referring to. That's what they're trying to sell in this secession movement. And Lincoln calls this a little disguise, exercise that they feel that they can exercise for just cause, but that cause is determined by them. And the merits of that proposition, in his view, are really not worthy of any merit discussion on the merits. He accuses them of, and there's some interesting use, this is 1861, and words that we use today. He accuses them of sugarcoating a rebellion, and something we also might say, drugging the public mind of their section of the country, leading people otherwise inclined to stay in the Union, to leave the Union under a farcical, and that's his word, farcical pretense. So there's a harsh rhetoric being used here. He says the sophism depends on assumption that there is an omnipotent and sacred supremacy pertaining to a state. That is that each state. And he says the state's power is just that reserved to them by the Constitution. Indeed, they've never been states outside of the Union. The original states passed into the Union, according to Lincoln, even before they cast off being dependent on Great Britain as a British colony. So the only states, there were only states when they came inside the Union. There was no magical omnipotence of states' rights. Again, magical omnipotence are his words. Not one state, except Texas, was ever a sovereignty, he argues. And Texas gave that up and acknowledged the Constitution and the U.S. laws and treaties, as I recall, late in the 1840s. Now, he says that states have their status in the Union, but no other legal status. The Union is their identity. If they break from the Union, they can only do so by revolution. So it's not some right they can exercise, which is secession, but it's in effect a revolution or a rebellion. And it was the Union itself that procured their independence from Great Britain. The Union gave them whatever independence and liberty they have. The Union is older than the states and created them. And he notes that there were no independent constitutions except that they were being formed in preparation for joining the Union. So the powers of the states are not to secede, but the powers of the states are simply those reserved to them in the Constitution. But he said, not all conceivable powers, and not a power certainly to destroy the government. It's a matter of locality and generality, he says. What's local to the states, of concern to the states, within the powers of the states. What's more general for the national point of view is reserved to the federal government. He makes the logical argument that nothing should be implied as law which would lead to an unjust or absurd consequences, which in his view is exactly what has happened. He also makes kind of an interesting argument that the Union is in debt for money applied to the so-called, he calls them, so-called seceding states. They're deadbeats in one sentence. And that money goes unpaid and refers to monies for the benefit of Florida and Texas. He says, if one state may secede, so may another. And when all have seceded, none will be left to pay the debt. Not just and that's not just to creditors when the money was borrowed. So this is kind of a auxiliary argument that you might not expect to be made, but is one that he's making here. He said the Southern seceders have themselves either discarded or retained the right of secession in their own Constitution. If they discarded it, they admit on principle it should not be in the U.S. Constitution. If they retained it in their Constitution, to be consistent, they must secede from one another whenever they find it the easiest way of settling debt. So Lincoln thought this analogy was obviously powerful for him, at least. The principle behind all of this is one of disintegration, one upon which no government can possibly exist if we're going to have this kind of disintegration. If all the states, let me do this. He says that politicians not partial to the power which made the Constitution are the ones calling for secession. And the Constitution speaks not of states, it speaks of we the people. It's not states, it's we that form this Constitution. So that's the difference then between secession and rebellion. Is secession is a claimed and a legal right to leave the Union. Rebellion is leaving the Union without legal right based on false premises.
I just wanted to just add a few things to end this portion of it, and then we'll go into, we have extensive statements that are made in the chat, and I'll be able to read this, Abigail, so let me I'll go out. One of the things he also points out is the two classes. One, he says, officers, something like 40 or 50% of the officers have left the Union to fight for the South. And he says not one soldier has left. Not one soldier or sailor has left. So again, these are the people who are remaining. It's the oligarchy, is the lack of a better word, who is doing the work. And he ends off, and again, this is what you said, Tom, but again, it's Lincoln's words. I got to read them. This is essentially a people's contest. That's interesting. It's not states. On the side of the Union, it's a struggle for maintaining the world, that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men. As a parenthetically, this is the only time he's really mentioning to a certain degree of slavery in this whole thing. And wasn't too thrilled. The South didn't like what he said here. He says, whose object, to lift artificial weights from the shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance at life, yielding to partial and temporary departures from necessity. This is the leading object of the government for whose existence we contend. So tangentially, he's now coming into slavery or mentioning it. And he says, I'm most happy to believe that the plain people understand and appreciate it. It's worthy to note that large numbers have been favored, and that's where he's going. So it's the individual who is part of the country, not the elite of the South. Unfortunately, we really didn't have time to develop who was the South, who were the people who were voting for it, and that's what it was. That's basically. I'll tell you something. There's so much that we could have gone on, and Tom has done that over the previous years with Jay Maloney. And each of these points that he's mentioned became a whole program in and of itself. So we truncated it, but I think we got the essence across of what they are. I'm going to take a look in the questions through the chat room. Good evening from Venezuela, Central America, Sacramento, California. Snowy South Carolina, Low Country. Certain movies were mentioned by Paul DeFazio, which is Abe Lincoln in Illinois and Massey. That was, I wanted to say that when it came to the last paragraph, the Mistress Court, I said I'd like to do my Raymond Massey. People say, who's Raymond Massey? But that's what it was. That's like you mentioned to people, the young kids, I never heard of that. Massey says, Lincoln, I can't believe such conditions exist. I couldn't do my Raymond Massey impression. But another movie on top of the trio is The Tall Target and Dick Powell. Curiosity, a detective named John Kennedy saved the life of Lincoln. It was 9 years before. This episode on the time tunnel of Washington on that train. Did Lincoln discuss the right of rebellion? I think we did that in the Declaration. We'll also check out Michael Klein's book, The Baltimore Plot by Dr. Braverman, who mentions that a pretty good film with Arkansas, Dick Powell. I don't think anybody ever heard of any these names, because I mentioned names to my grandkids and they have no idea what I'm talking about. I just mentioned Frank Sinatra. That was another one they didn't know, but that's something else. Okay, John Sarna. That's from here it comes from the Arkansas. Here we go. Articles of Confederation 1 and 13 Perpetual Union examples assumed by the Covenant More Perfect Union. Article 6, Previous Engagement Clause, Northwest Ordinance permits federal government to restrict slavery in new territories. And this, as he explained since Cooper Union, fugitive slaves, if violation of establishment beaten, they can't be returned. And Article 6, Clause 2, there is no constitutional provision to beat slaves. Supremacy of Constitution requires justice even in slave contract. There's John. That's you heard John before, and here's another one for everyone. This is even with diverging interpretations on the Union of Fugitive Slave Act, Northern Personal Liberty. What about the early and generally widespread belief there would be no civil war? That if it happened, there would only be one battle to resolve the issues. How influential is ultimately horribly wrong, certainly before Bull Run. I think
Just
that's
one point on that, Rich. Lincoln says in the July 4th address, in asking for 400,000 men and 400 million, that he was going to make the war, or expected the war, to be short and decisive. A few months later, we have Bull Run, and that ended that.
Here's another. Then it continues on. It says also a newspaper editor's. Oh, come on, Richard, you lost it. Article of Federation of the Virgin Court. Horace Greeley wrote, "Erring sisters should be allowed to depart in peace." How influential were media proclamations? I must answer. This is one thing I got to answer. One of the things you always say, we once had I think we had a meeting. Could the Civil War be negotiated? And now this was given about 20 years ago, and certainly have changed. So you let the South go. What about the slaves? They stay there. They stay there. So we said, well, we washed our hands of slavery, and yet we don't say nothing about they're going to keep them. This war had to be fought. It had to be over with this. I think we discussed the advantage of suspending habeas corpus. I think you've answered, and I think because they just got. They were able to conduct the war without these people destroying it. You must understand, Virginia is to the south. It's a slave state. Maryland is to the north. It's a slave state. Baltimore is probably the most obviously a southern city. So he's surrounded by this. And what do you do at this point? Oh, you remember, Tom? I think you'll know this. Must all laws be broken, but this one saved, or something? That that sentence. I can't think of it offhand. Must all laws.
Referring to.
Must we break all laws to save one?
Yeah, that's part of Lincoln's argument with regard to the habeas corpus.
Yeah.
I mean, this law, which he implies really helps out guilty people, is one law, and we're going to have all laws of the House of Law fall. That isn't the metaphor he uses, but House of Law fall in sacrifice to this into this one. And so we're doing the greater good. And this is in pursuit of the greater good.
Yeah, we're saving the body by amputating the arm. You don't do it the other way around. And that's the other what he also mentions in here. Post-war neutral name for what's the late unpleasantness. Unfortunately, I got to tell you something. So much of this was changed by the myth of the lost cause and how this happened. You come home from the war, and the kid says, what were you fighting for? You lost the war. You fought for slavery? So they had to come out with a different reason, and that's the lost cause. Tom and Rich, a critical step after Fort Sumter was Lincoln called for troops and imposition of blockade, which caused several more states to secede. Lincoln does not seek Congressional authority to exercise its war power and does not explicitly ask for congressional ratification after the fact, even though he asked Congress for more troops and funding. He appears to gloss over the critical and triggering step in bringing about the war. Okay, that's he triggering the war. Does anybody object to the unilateral presence? Read that last sentence. He appears, and that's Joanna, he appears to gloss over critical and triggering steps in bringing about the war. You got to answer that one.
Well, I kind of got lost in the verbiage there.
Okay, here's one sentence. It goes, it mentions the fact of what it was.
Oh, you're talking about this.
Yeah, but here's the sentence. He appears
Yeah.
to gloss over a critical and triggering step in bringing about the war. I don't think
this was just to clarify, this was a major step in defining the powers of the commander-in-chief.
Right.
And this was the event among many, but certainly a major event in prompting the war, because at this point, the entire, what remained of the states that had not seceded to defend themselves. And I carefully read the July 4th message on this very issue. And what surprised me was that, yeah, he spent a lot of time on the habeas corpus issue, but not on this one, which is actually more important. And I just wondered what the reception was in Congress, because they weren't consulted. There was no collaboration on the right to declare war.
Yeah. I don't know if you can answer that, Rich. I can't. I was, when I read that, Jay, I was going to refer to you because you did the program on, the various legal issues regarding, Lincoln's. I forget how you phrased your topic. So, but I really don't know the answer to that.
at that point, they really didn't argue. They just heard this monotone reading, and that's basically what was it all about. So it wasn't a question of they went into lengthy detail. That's the only thing I could find out. Again, playing devil's advocate, and there are two more. Let me just say, very good program. Thank you to Jacob. Judge Harper, excellent program. Thanks, both of you. And somebody, very good program. Okay, and here's the last one. Again, playing devil's advocate and looking at three more points. I don't think this was part of really what we are. What it was, Southern reference to precedent, the abortive convention of 1834 and 15. That was never mentioned. That I know. That wasn't really mentioned. The arguable stepping stone of the Constitution Supremacy Court, and Lincoln's hopes to appeal to Southern Whigs to circumvent secession. He didn't go anywhere with that. They were just a minority of the group. And that was about the extent of it. We did hit 100 people tonight, so I'm pretty glad about that. That'll conclude tonight. From next month, we're going to have Jeff Hunt returning on Lincoln and Lee, and this time the Battle of Bristow Station, and then we'll have a continuing on also on the way to Rappahannock Station. So we're going to have the battle for the next two programs. And again, I want to thank you all for coming. Abigail, thank you for putting up with me tonight. But you become a little tense of what you're doing, and you look for certain things to happen. So I apologize, Abigail. And that's it. We'll say good night.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Thank you. Very good program.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. I'm going to end the meeting now.
Okay. Take care, everyone.